Recording is started.
Sorry, everybody, for the wait.
You get extra cooking. Before you jump on my cheek, that's how it usually works.
Why my head is still down there, but I guess we'll work with that.
So we do now? No. Matthew, Yana's here.
I think so. I think we're good.
Okay.
I don't want to try it because I can't go backwards. I can. Yeah, so we're going to talk about adaptive reuse. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our firm first, and then we'll move on to that. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Jason Sparrow. I've been at Bryan for 29 years. And that's pretty much my whole career. So, and then here's Ben.
I've also been at O'Brien for a long time, about 15 years. That's also me.
Trying to advance it.
No, I'm trying to go back. There you go. Yeah, so I'm married. I have 2 kids. A little bit about me. I like to get outdoors, calm water, kayaking. That's me in the upper left, building an Eagle project. I'm a consultant on a lot of construction type Eagle projects. So those are some of my most prideful structures. And then,
Yeah, so a little bit of me. I have a few kids. I have 3 kids and happily married, and say my kids keep me busy during the day and they keep me awake at night. So look forward to when they go to college and I can sleep again. But yeah, one of my hobbies is I really enjoy baseball, and my son got into baseball and I got to be his coach for the last 2 seasons. So that's really big time one of my other things to do outside of work. And then the picture on the lower left is one that Jason and I both have on our slides, is the West Falls Church project. We've worked on that project with you all, and it's been a great experience.
So Ellert Bryan was founded in 1981 by Wayne Bryan and George Ellert. Wayne is still around working in our Virginia office. We do all kinds of structural engineering projects, buildings, but any type of building you can probably think of, we've probably done it. We're about 42 people now. We have our main offices in Tysons, Virginia. We've got about 30 people there. And then we have a Washington, DC entity with the CBE. We've got about 5 people there. And then we have a new Orlando, Florida office that we opened about 2 years ago. We've got 3 people there now. Like I said, we do just about any type of building you can think of. These are some of the markets we're in from our website. And certainly multifamily is a big part of our work, and a lot of adaptive reuse, both multifamily and other types of projects. We do work across the country. We're registered in 41 states. Washington, DC, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And we've completed projects all across the world, a lot of U.S. embassies, all across the U.S. as well. So today we're going to talk about adaptive reuse and focus specifically on the biggest hot topic of our time right now. It seems office to residential conversions. So the first part, I'll talk about the building code aspects, and I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I just want to touch on existing building codes and some of the local things going on. Then it's going to talk about how and why, and then get into a little bit more of the specifics about office to residential conversions and some of the things to look for and think about as you get into those types of projects. And I'll talk about some case studies of some example projects that we've done here in DC. All right, so let's talk about the building code. I didn't know this until I had been practicing for probably 10, 15 years, but there is such a thing as the International Existing Building Code. Of course, it probably didn't exist the first 10 years I was practicing either, but so the International Building Code, well, so we've got the global sort of IBC, right? And most jurisdictions either adopted that directly or they have their own modified version of it. In DC, we've got the DC Building Code. Virginia has the Virginia Construction Code. IBC is, or Maryland just has the IBC. But they're basically all just the IBC with a little bit of tweaks. And the IBC applies to all new construction and all new construction elements, even in these adaptive reuse projects. And then depending on what you're doing to the building, there are thresholds that are going to kick you back into the IBC from the existing building code. Here's just a summary of the different versions of the code that we have got in this local area. Washington, DC is still back on 2015 IBC, and they've adopted, and that references the International Existing Building Code from 2015. A lot of the structural loads that we need for our design come from the ASCE 7, and that version of IBC references the 2010 version of ASCE 7. Virginia has recently adopted 2021 IBC, 2021 International Existing Building Code, and for some reason they decided that they would go ahead and, instead of referencing what the IBC does, the ASCE 716 from 2021, they've decided they want to adopt ASCE 722, which has a lot of structural changes in it. So we're catching up with that. But that's a topic for another day. Maryland, they kept it simple. 2021 IBC, 2021 IEBC, and 2016 ASCE 7. This is the reference of the IEBC from the IBC. That's how we get there in the code. I'm not going to read that for you. Where do these apply? If you've got an existing building and you're changing it, you're probably going to be using the IEBC. There are certainly a wide range of how much you're disturbing an existing building, and all of that's defined in the IEBC. And there's certain triggers and thresholds about that means, and where you go in the IEBC, and if you have to go back to the IBC to evaluate your building. You can always choose, if you'd elect to just say, forget the IEBC, I'm just going to use the IBC. I don't care about all that other stuff. And on some projects where you're maybe demoing a big chunk of the building, that might make more sense. But there is some nuggets in the IGBC that are helpful. So this is just a good sort of summary of the organization of how the IEBC is organized. The first two chapters are definitions and administrative stuff. But chapter 3 sort of talks about where to go in the code. And for these types of projects, where it's an adaptive reuse type project, there's 3 different options about how you navigate the code. There's the prescriptive method, the work area method, and the performance method. And you get to choose. You can pick whatever one you want to use. It's up to the design team and the developer. And of course, you can just use the IEBC or the IBC. So what are some of the terms in the IEBC that are important for these projects? And what are we doing in a typical office residential conversion? Change of occupancy, assuming it is really an office to residential conversion, then yes, that's a definite. We're changing the occupancy class of the building from business to residential. An alteration, more than likely you're altering the building in some manner. And there are 3 levels of alterations defined in the IEBC. Basically, level 1 is changing the wallpaper. Level 2 is you're adding some windows and doors or moving things around a little bit. And then you're into level 3 after that, basically. So most of the time, if you're changing from office to residential, you're probably going to be in level 3. And addition, maybe you may be adding square footage to the existing building, maybe not, depending on the job. So those are the things to look for in the code, and they trigger different requirements. You may have noticed this exception that was listed on one of the previous slides. And it would be really nice if you could use this exception for some simple office to residential conversions. But at the bottom there, it lists what it applies to, and it only applies to alterations. It does not apply to change of occupancy. So if you're altering a building, you can use this exception, and if your building complies with the laws in existence at the time the building was constructed, then there's a lot of things you don't have to worry about. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply. So how do you apply the IEBC? So for structural engineers, there's the prescriptive method that we talked about and the work area method. And prescriptive method, they're basically equivalent as far as the structural engineering analysis is concerned. The performance method basically requires that you analyze the existing building for all of the current code requirements in the IBC. So that is a very different endeavor if you're a structural engineer. So those first 2 methods, 2 thumbs up. The second one, I would hesitate to recommend. So again, for the structural engineer, as long as you're using those first 2 methods, if you're evaluating existing gravity lift load carrying members, there's a 5% change rule. So if you're increasing the load or increasing the demand capacity ratio by more than 5%, it kicks you to the IBC. If you're less than that, then it's okay, you're good. And similarly, for lateral load carrying members, brace frames, shear walls, if you're increasing that demand capacity ratio by more than 10%, kicks you into the IBC. If you're less than that, then you're good to go. I'm not gonna say this is exhaustive, but here's a couple nuggets for the architect. For the prescriptive method, one chapter, everything's in chapter 5, so that's nice. If you're doing alterations, all the new stuff, that has to be IBC requirement. The existing building says it must not be less complying than it was before. So if you're changing the use, and that might be an issue. But if you're, let's just say you got an office building and you're modifying it, you just need to make sure that anything you modify is bringing it, it's improving the situation, it's not making it worse. It probably will require a sprinkler system to be added. That one. That seems to be pretty consistent. And then there is an exception for stairways if they don't meet the riser and shed dimensions that's in the IBC, and you don't have enough room to modify that stair. There's a grandfather clause for that. The next method is the work area method. This one is very detailed. It spreads itself across 7 chapters in the IEBC rather than 1. They separate alteration into those 3 levels I talked about earlier. Again, it's going to probably require a sprinkler system. It's probably going to require a fire alarm system is added. Has that same less complying clause as the first method, and it has the same exception for stairway. So that last method, the one I give 2 thumbs down, the performance method. It's all in 1 chapter again, it's chapter 13, unlucky 13. And it's basically a scoring system that you evaluate for fire safety, means of egress, and general safety, what they call. And you go through this whole thing, rate each of those categories. There's a whole table in the end, and you need a passing score. And if you don't pass, then you figure out a way to change what you're doing to get a passing score. I think there's more flexibility to figure out how you want to change and create that passing score. But it's just a lot more complex than either of those other 2 methods. So that's the performance method. And of course, as the structural engineer, he has to basically use the IBC to evaluate the existing building. And, you know, if you have a nice set of structural drawings from the original building construction, your structural engineer might be able to do that. Could be a lot of work still, but you can do it. If you got a historic building and you don't know what's behind the walls and you don't know what's in the concrete, how it's reinforced, that's very difficult to do.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit, before we get into the office to residential specific category, I wanted to talk a little bit about adaptive reuse just in general. Some of this is basic, but I thought it'd be good to cover it. So why adaptive reuse? Well, obviously, building like this is beautiful, but we already have the bones. If it goes well, if it's the right building and the right design, it should be more economical than building a brand new building. A lot of existing buildings can be grandfathered in with zoning regulations and stuff. So sometimes you can get away with things in an older building than you could with a new building. Obviously, in a downtown urban area like this, you don't have a lot of open plots of land that you can just build whatever you want. So sometimes you don't have the option to build new. A benefit is certainly that it's sustainable. Again, if done right, it can be a lot more sustainable and be a lot less embodied carbon than a brand new building might be. And as it says, I mean, nowadays with this big change, we'll get into it more, but with this big change, we have so much available office space. It's not being used like it once was. There can be tax credits and other financial incentives for developers. There's certainly marketing benefits for the appeal, either a historic building. And like we call it excitement benefits, where, you know, locals might be really proud to be a part of that building. They want to live in that building because they've seen it or it has some meaning to it. So it obviously can be faster if done right, depending on what you're doing. So we're going to spend some time and talk about our tools. And by the way, I should say, if anyone has any questions, please interrupt us, or if you say, hey, we already know all this stuff, whatever. You know, we're here to help us, so speak up. But I'll get into some of these a little bit more, but you know, I will say again and again, existing drawings, if available, are king. They are so meaningful to these jobs. But we have other tools as well. People in the know. You might have a building engineer who's worked at the building for 20 years. He or she is going to know a lot about that building that we don't know. Obviously, making site visits and observing it, looking behind the walls, doing whatever we can to see it. Sometimes understanding when the building was built and understanding the code that it was built to at the time will tell us a lot. The structural perspective, we can understand the loads that should have been designed to, a lot of other things as well. Historical data. If it's a certain type of system, we might know, okay, that system acted in a certain way, or it was designed to a certain standard. That can tell us a lot. And then my favorite is judgment calls. I mean, there's just a lot of judgment in these buildings. So my soapbox for existing drawings, search. These drawings are so important to the project, and I can't tell you how many times we say, hey, are existing drawings available? No. Okay, are they really available? No. But really, are they available? And then we find drawings. So, no. So we have to just keep digging and be creative. Don't just say, okay, well, I don't have them handy, but you know, what about permitting records? And maybe any permit. Maybe we don't have the original plans, so we have plans from a renovation that was done a few years ago, and that would tell us more information. A lot of times in this area, it's a small world. We might know the previous designers, might be able to call them and find out information. I mentioned maintenance offices and storage areas, or also storage areas. They may be hidden. Quick story has happened to me on 2 jobs recently. One was a renovation of a church, and the other one was a renovation of an older restaurant. But in the restaurant in particular, I was crawling around, and you know, we'd ask a million questions. Are there existing drawings? No. So we're doing the site visit, and I'm there with the architect, and we're crawling around. We're up in the ceiling. We're measuring all the stuff because we don't have any drawings. And finally, it's kind of in the back kitchen area. There's like a little storage room, and I'm back in there. And then there's a little like platform. It's a little sketchy, but you know, I climbed up there because I want to get up in the ceiling and see what I can see. And sure enough, there's just a couple boxes of drawings right there after I did the whole site visit. So we took that down and spent the rest of the time taking pictures of that, and we had our drawings. So anyway, you never know where they might be hiding from you. I mentioned facility managers. You know, if someone has been in that building for a long time and they've been repairing it and maintaining it, they are going to know a lot about that building. They can really help you. And then if you do get the drawings, always trust but verify. You can never assume that the building was built for those drawings, but it's a helpful tool. So you never know what renovations were done. You never know if it was built differently than the drawings say. And we also have tools like building scans, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, these point cloud models. Those can be very useful as long as you're aware of limitations. You're not just taking it as gospel, but you're understanding what it's telling you and what it's not telling you. People in the know, I've mentioned that. Site visits, that's pretty clear that you need to go to the site to look at the building, but you know, the more thoughtful you can be at the site, the more information you get. It's amazing what clues you can tune into that might not just jump right out at you. I'll say, you know, a lot of times the architects and developers are visiting these sites, maybe under the board or before the developer even knows what they want to do. They're just kind of exploring. And we just ask kindly, please include us. We love to be involved at that stage, even if we're not a part of the project yet. Even if we're doing it kind of ahead of getting paid for it, we enjoy being part of that. And I think we can add a lot of value through our experience, but also from a structural perspective, you might see things that are helpful to the direction of the project. And a lot of times you go and it's like, okay, we came with 10 questions, we're leaving with 20. You know, you go and you get some information, but then you find more information that needs to be investigated further. And of course, plan for more than usual visits and expect the unexpected. Never assume something. It's amazing how many, unfortunately, it's like sometimes you think that the designers or contractors were just trying to be cool to whoever was going to do a renovation. Every time you turn the corner, you see something hard. But you know, if you have that attitude of, I'm just going to have an open mind and see what I see, that can be very valuable. So like I mentioned, clues. You know, these are some pictures of in the bottom left. Hopefully you can see there's, you know, probably was a stair there at some point. Even though it's not there, we might not have drawings. The picture at the right shows a renovation where there's, you know, a control joint or some sort of joint down the middle of the building, and then they put something on top of that. So we know something's going on there that's not abundantly clear. And so some more tools, the codes, I'm not going to go through these again, but as Jason mentioned, the codes can be very useful. Understanding and being familiar with what the code's going to offer you is very important. But specific to codes, checking the local regulations, sometimes a local jurisdiction will be able to help you a lot. This picture on the image on the left is, I'm not going to go through it, but it's from Arlington's website. And Arlington County actually allow and encourage flexibility for some of the requirements. You know, these jurisdictions are incentivized to try to reuse some of these buildings. And so sometimes if there's a requirement that can maybe budge a little bit, they often will give you a waiver, or they at least help you out. It's worth having those conversations early on. And that's included in zoning as well. Historic data, you know, can you look through simple as a Google search, or can you look through old photographs, or can you find, I mentioned codes, if you find the previous code when it was built, that can tell you a lot. But like I said, my favorite is judgment calls, get creative. We love to be creative, and I think most of us in this architecture and engineering industry love to be creative, and it makes our jobs fun. David, you were talking earlier about, you know, a simple flat plate construction that never happens in these types of buildings. There's no textbook answer. Everything is unusual or different, and it just requires thoughtfulness and creativity and thinking about, okay, what's really happening there? What can we do? What can we not do? What assumptions can we make that we can be confident in, but you know, we can move forward in without being 100% sure of the answer. And I like to say communication with contractors is huge. You know, this is usually more on the construction side, but having a good relationship with your contractor, having a good contractor, hopefully, through these adaptive reuse projects makes all the difference in the world, because they're going to be out there every day seeing new things and seeing things that are different from maybe what you assumed, and having that open line of communication on their life. And a lot of times when we don't know the answer, we can put assumptions on the drawings. We think this is a 12 by 12 concrete element, verify in field. And if it's not, okay, then we'll adjust. That's a way to communicate with the contractor. Sometimes beyond site visits, then I mentioned you might need more information. One thing that we do quite a bit is testing and investigation. We need to engage maybe a third-party testing agency or a contractor to help us understand a little more about the building. So the photo here is a concrete cylinder, a concrete floor that was taken from the building, and they're going to break it to test the strength of the concrete. But a lot of times, some selective demolition. Sometimes it's as simple as that. We're going to cut a couple holes in the drywall and see what we see, and then we can extrapolate that information. To be verified later. And then there's destructive testing. of the actual structure. So sometimes I mentioned cores. If you have a concrete building, that's often needed to understand the strength of the concrete. There's also rebar sampling. You can take some rebar and you can, for structural purposes, the tension of the rebar is what's most important. So we can actually take it to a lab and so it fails and understand what the capacity is. And then I mentioned the historical data. Based on the test results, that can clue us into, okay, this was probably built to ASTM whatever in 1965, and the strength you can assume is this. Allows us to make better educated guesses, educated assumptions. And structural steel, you can do the same thing. You call it coupons, but you can, find a place in a beam that's not super important structurally and cut a little piece out of it, take it to a lab and stretch it, and that will tell us a lot. A lot of times, if we assume that there's been several jobs where that's been really advantageous to us because we've assumed that a beam has a certain strength based on its age, when in reality it has a significantly higher strength. Use that higher strength, we can get away with doing the work without as much cost.
Then you call that taking coupons?
We call it a coupon. Yeah, that's a funny word, but yeah, the little piece of steel is called a coupon. Doesn't work at the grocery store. And then there is non-destructive testing as well. I'm working on a job right now where we're doing this. You can take GPR X-rays and say you have a concrete slab and you don't know what the rebar arrangement is. You can scan it and understand, okay, well, I know the spacing. I might chip a few little spots and measure the size of the bar. And you can do different things like that that will tell you a lot. The scanning can also tell you the depths of the different elements. So a lot of times after this initial site visit and after the job is starting to move, it's a good time to talk about what kind of testing can we do to get more information on the buildings. And then feasibility studies. These are, often a little bit of extra cost, so maybe a little more time, and maybe the owner is really ready to get moving on the job. But these can save so much time down the road and be so beneficial. From a structural perspective, what kind of strengthening are we going to do this? What's the impact? When we cut a hole here and have is it okay if we just do that, or is it going to require that we have to add shear walls and brace frames or do something very big? Sometimes we don't know that until we spend a little time doing analysis. And I know it's the same architecturally as well. What are some of the structural depths? Is that going to work with the head height we have? What are some options that we have? We have an example here. This is a building in Georgetown, the British International School. We just went through where I believe they wanted to take the existing roof and make it a nice finished space and amenity area. And it sounds great, love it. And unfortunately, this is not a success story because we went through the feasibility study and it was determined it was just too cumbersome. This was on top of the existing building. And we've seen that a lot where, the roof is designed for, rain and snow, and now we want to add rock that's on top, and it's a big deal structurally. Sometimes roofs have reserve capacities where maybe you can handle that. Other times, in this case, it did not. There were also architectural reasons where, we have to extend the stair and the elevator up to the roof. I think some other things that made this to where having the feasibility study up front saves a lot of time and effort and cost. Otherwise, this would be something to learn. So and obviously it's important to coordinate with all the disciplines. It's easy for us, at least as structural engineers, to get into our silos. It's easy for the MEP teams to get in their silos, but a lot of times, especially in adaptive reuse, it's so important because there's just so much additional things that are needed. But if we're adding rooftop equipment to an existing building, let's get a little more creative than just plopping a big unit in the middle of the roof. Where can we put it that's going to help us structurally, or it's going to be the least intrusive structurally? This little image on the lower right, I don't expect you to actually look at the details of it, but just an example of a project I did where we added a rooftop unit, and believe it or not, all that steel framing was actually far more economical than what it was to put that unit right on top of the roof. So the roof was an old wooden roof that really had very little capacity. We'd have to reinforce it, and there would be a problem with the ceiling, and they were trying to use the space below, and we ended up coming up with a kind of complicated steel dunnage frame. We're posting up with existing columns, and then we have some cantilever. We're working around existing MEP. It was a mess, but at the end of the day, that's what the framing plan looked like, and it allowed that change to happen, whereas otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. And then, a thing to be talking about, I don't know how much you guys have gotten into sustainable design and kind of studying embodied carbon, life cycle analysis, that type of stuff, but it is a benefit for these adaptive reuse projects, and it can be a real benefit to developers for a variety of reasons. But I won't go into too much detail. We can do a whole seminar on this topic, but there is certainly a benefit. And we can help with that as well. We're a part of, in the structural engineering world, it's called SE 2050, where we're committed to net zero by 2050. I think for you all, it's 2030, so you're ahead of us 20 years. But we can do life cycle assessments. We can make recommendations. And help with that. Okay, so now that we've all been building to office to residential, so why should we convert offices to residential? Well, there's a lot of office space not being used, so why not? There's a great opportunity with offices. They're in excellent location, often very good condition, and they're just not being used anymore. As we all know, business has changed, and there's just not the need for the space. Jason found this, which we included because we thought it was interesting. This 2001 L Street job had been purchased in 2015 for about 100 million, almost $99 million, and it just sold for 30 million. So the purpose of that is just to show that developers can get a pretty good deal on some of these buildings now. And sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not, but there's certainly opportunity. And there's many success stories, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's success and what's not. Not all office buildings are suitable for this. It has to be the right building. That's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. What is the right building? Okay. So it's not always easy. This again creates creativity, and it's interesting how not all are. I certainly say they're not all created equal. They can vary by a lot. We were just talking beforehand about we have this job on the right, this L Street job, pretty much tore down. It's an existing office building. We pretty much tore it all the way down to grade, built it back up as we see here. That's what made the most sense out of the studies. There's another one that we have going on that just started construction on 15th Street, where it's the opposite. We kept the entire frame of the building. We didn't add any levels, but we're just doing a big renovation to all the concrete floors. And we have, 100 million cores going through all the slabs, and there's all sorts of other challenges. But the point is that all of these jobs are different. You have to have an open mind. You have to have creativity, and yeah, it's what makes it fun.
Because of the amount of concrete construction in DC, particularly low tension concrete construction versus, say, Baltimore, where the exact same building, same age, is probably steel frame. But for you guys, which is scarier or which is the easier?
Post-tension buildings are harder, and just there's less flexibility. Cut a hole in it, you're gonna cut all those cables, and that's a I would say if it's not post-tension, it's probably equal. What would you say, Jason?
If you have drawings, say maybe it's equal. If you don't have drawings, it's a lot easier to go measure a steel beam than it is to look into a concrete slab and see how it's reinforced. Right. It's very difficult to find out what you've got if it's just concrete.
So the careful selection of the building is important. I mean, the developers can look at location, kind of amenities are nearby, what's economically feasible. And really, typically, the common denominator in these is that it's often more economically feasible if there's room to grow. If you're already maxed out and you can't really add any more, and all you're doing is just cutting holes in the building, but you're not adding anything back, typically those aren't going to work out. Jobs like this where you can cut down, maybe you cut down the whole building or whole superstructure, or you cut out a couple floors and you can build back several floors on top at a tighter density. You're getting more space back in the same volume, and that's often what starts to turn the needle over to the greens for make these buildings make sense financially. So start with the opportunity. What's the good news about these conversions? Well, structurally speaking, the most obvious one is that the live load changes. So live loads, people, desks, furniture, all this stuff. For an office building varies, but typically they're designed for 100 pounds per square foot. In a residential building, you're typically looking at 40 pounds per square foot. Now you do add back some partitions, some additional weight, but you might be pretty close to half of your design load. And so that means the floors typically work well from a structural perspective. It also means the foundations, and this is actually more important, the foundations have a lot of reserve capacity. Even if you're adding back more floors than the building had, when you do the math, you might still end up with less total load to the foundation because of this live load change. And now also typically office buildings require more elevators, so you get extra shafts to use for MEP. That's a good and a bad thing. But for this slide, we'll say it's a good thing. You have space to add stuff, and you have opportunities to increase over square footage.
And if you're adding floors, for the live load for those new floors, can they be less because it's residential than it was for the main building?
Right.
You don't have to match it.
Right. So if you had 8 office floors and you went to 12 residential floors, the load might be roughly the same. I think the weights of materials and stuff. Okay, so I unfortunately have more slides on the constraints than the opportunities. But offices have large floor plates, many of them do, and often there's not the requirement for having a window at every cubicle. So it's often hard. The perimeter works well, but it's hard to get light into all the bedrooms and all the units. So typically that's looking like we're going to be cutting holes to the building to get more extinguishing. LFRS, lateral force resisting system. So we say, you can remove bays, please talk to us. We can maybe advise on what bays are more advantageous or less advantageous to remove. But it often affects that lateral force resisting system is the building's lateral ability to stand up against wind and earthquake and its own stability. So if you cut it in the wrong spot, even one small hole can make a big difference in building stability, whereas other spots might have a lesser impact. Typically, these buildings we end up creating from you picture just a theoretical square, you end up making a C or maybe an H. That gives you the surface area you need for the windows light. Again, cutting up the floor plate like that does also affect more than just that particular floor. It affects our buildings. So sometimes we need to add back in some bracing. So maybe it's the X braces that you see, or maybe it's the masonry walls and concrete walls to stabilize the building. Additionally, I mentioned that there's more elevators and stairs, but often they're not in the right place. So often, these buildings, this change triggers a code issue from an architecture standpoint, from an egress standpoint. So typically, we're adding new stair shafts throughout the building. Sometimes they're on the outside, sometimes they're cutting a hole through the middle. And are we serving the roof? And what are some of the things that we can do creatively to get the right access to all the units? As the unit layout is obviously different from the office layout. So this is an example, and at the end we're going to give a couple other examples of projects we've done, but thought now would be a good time to share. This is 22 Light Street in Baltimore. It was a smaller project, but it was a successful office residential conversion. So I mentioned the light. We cut out on the picture on the right is the after. We cut out a shaft in the building and got some more windows to those units.
The notch.
Yeah, this notch right here.
And then you can see the stair shaft popping up above the roof in the back. That was a new stair shaft run down to the building, which enabled that to happen. So in this case, it wasn't overly reduced. Sometimes the cutout is a lot bigger than a small notch, the floor plate. Another issue is the facade. You can think about, an office facade, whether it's, regardless of how it looks, it might not really be suitable for a multifamily building. And coming back with a heavier facade, if you want to add in brick, or if you want to add in balconies, or something that is going to be a heavier system, the slab edge of the floor might not be able to handle that. So we might be creating problems. So often we're coming back with a lighter system. Maybe it's EPIS or something like that. So that's another thing with the facade is talk to your engineers and your whole team early on. It affects a lot. The MEP and the fire protection systems typically don't work for residential use in an office building. So almost always it's a complete redo of all the MEP systems. So you have, countless cores and shafts and different things you're doing, different challenges you're dealing with associated with that. Again, that affects us. So it requires even more coordination between the disciplines than even a normal building does. And we say study it early because this is something that can really kill a project if you discover down the road that you have an MET problem.
So in your facade comment about like for operable windows and things like that, residential, that's part of your facade sort of messaging here. So look at, I know it's not so much a structural issue, but
Some exceptions for operable windows, depending on where you are, but yeah, that can certainly be, it's certainly a consideration. Yes, with the facade.
Yeah, it's also the weight. Yeah, big part of it.
How often in a new building or in a construction, let's say you're not adding bulk or anything, do you find the lateral forces don't meet the current code because of the change in use? Like what is
Well, the existing building code if you're not making a lot of changes, the existing building code allows you to say, okay, if it worked before and we're not really changing, we're not adding load, so we're not reducing the capacity of the existing system, then we're still good. But yes, a lot of older buildings, especially the 80s and 70s in this area, didn't really have a defined lateral system. The concrete frame was doing the work, but it wasn't really ever evaluated for any lateral loads. So there are a lot of those buildings out there that if you do start to change, add loads, add demand to that system, or reduce the capacity of that system in any way, you're going to be in trouble.
But you think even with the change of occupancy, you wouldn't have to add lateral capacity?
Not necessarily. Yeah, the existing building code allows you to, as long as you're not changing that demand capacity ratio back more than 10%, allows you to keep the system.
Share too, like as Jason mentioned, a lot of these buildings don't have a defined lateral system. So there have been for the job we worked on in Alexandria where it was a steel framed building, 3 stories or so, and there was just no stability, no defined brace frames or moment frames or anything like that. So you just
Are you familiar?
We're very familiar with this. We have a 4-story steel frame building in Alexandria that has no lateral.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was the same one. But when we were doing a big renovation, but we fortunately realized that the brick veneer was really serving as what was stabilizing the building. And it was a hard conversation to have, but as part of the renovation, they were opening up some exterior windows, which you think is no big deal structurally, but it actually had a very big impact on the overall building stability. So that was an example, just something that you wouldn't think would trigger a structural problem, but it unfortunately did.
Is that because of wind loading or sheer capacity? Or
It was just overall stability. So wind and earthquake, lateral loads, and then, just keeping the whole thing just
and a change in the building codes.
That was not triggered by a change in the code. That was just I think the original building. I guess my point is just sometimes the original building is lacking in a big way. And as soon as you start modifying it, then you own it, then you need to bring it up to modern code. Sometimes modern elevators, you have this nice elevator shaft, but your new elevator doesn't fit. So, you know, if you need a stretcher or you have different reasons, there might be reasons why the new elevator is bigger. So, you know, talk to your elevator supplier and they see what they can do. They give you some flexibility. And there's some flexibility too, again, from some of the local jurisdictions. If they're incentivized to help you get this building built and, you know, this is making or breaking the job, they might be able to help you out. So one good and bad thing is existing parking in office is more than residential. So it's good because you have all this extra parking space. The bad is what do you do with it? You don't want parking. The parking's not as valuable. It's really difficult space to reclaim. It's often below grade. It might be, you know, it's in a garage like this. It's not really ideal for finishing and making a nice finished space. There's ramps. What do you do with the ramp aside from cutting it out and replacing it with a flat floor, which is a big deal? Slopes for drainage or whatever else there is. There's different challenges. And I think you can get creative. We've seen some kind of unique ideas with maybe some building amenities that aren't quite as high end, being put low grade or being in the previous parking areas. We've also seen clients rent out that parking space and get a little extra income for some of the adjacent buildings or for public parking. And then we saw one actually rent out that space to some artists, which they had less, you know, different needs, and they were able to make that work in a former parking space. So you can get creative, but it's not always straightforward. Again, another good and bad, the floor to floor height is typically taller. So if you're keeping the floors and not just knocking down and replacing them, it's good because you get tall ceilings, and I like tall ceilings. It's often you don't get the density that you might get if you're building a new building, where you really max, especially in a place like DC where you have a height restriction. Sometimes they're so tall that you can actually fit a sub mid-level mezzanine within that space. And this was a project of Northern Exchange where some of the units actually had a mid-height mezzanine that was used like a loft. I think was used as the bedroom. That was just a way to gain a little extra square footage in each of the units without actually adding levels above. It was adding levels within. So what's often done, I mentioned that because of the load benefits, you can typically reuse the foundations, replacing that. What often makes sense in a place like DC is tearing a few floors down, maybe it's all the floors or it's some of them, and then creating what we call a podium slab, which is basically just a gigantic transfer floor where you can have a different architectural program above and below, or you can have bearing walls coming down and transfer columns or whatever you need to do. But what we can do with that podium slab is we can build up on the existing columns and then have beams or a concrete slab span, usually beams, span across to carry whatever the structural system is above. And then above, we can use a lightweight system. It might be wood, it might be light gauge, depending on the construction type. And we found that typically works well, and that for most cases, that's the path forward on these buildings. So some options, you know, if you're doing light gauge, you might have infinity or upper core floors are typically really thin concrete slabs with a composite metal deck underneath. Then you might have joists or something else. But wood frame systems work if you're low rise. Mass timber is great. We've looked at many jobs doing that. Had a hard time seeing those actually move forward because mass timber is still kind of an emerging thing. But mass timber is a great opportunity for doing some of this stuff because we can get the height the code allows it. So the higher you can also do structural steel. I mentioned the loads and sometimes rooftop amenity spaces can be added. if the strengthening of that roof, or if you're adding a new roof, even though you're adding that extra, it becomes an extra floor, the foundation still might be able to handle it. And the key is getting the loads back into the columns. So that's why the transfer slab is important, because we're not bringing loads down and changing the load path building. We're bringing all that weight back to where it was originally designed to carry it. Or carry weight. So we want to run through a couple example projects. I'll let Jason do.
Before we go to the examples, I have a question about.
Yeah.
The project we're working on, some of the structure was integrated, metal decks, steel beams. You mentioned we had some assumptions about, we expect this to have X or Y capacity. But what about those repairs? And more so in this area, what have you guys seen about that? How do you tackle it?
How do you budget?
I mean, ideally, you can do a survey before and get access to it. That's the ideal. If you can't do that, it's really difficult to budget.
And we didn't have the ceilings out, so there was water infiltration in certain places where the deck was rusted through. There was places where columns were sitting in a concrete pocket and the water facade leaked. And the column was now sitting in a bathtub for the last 40 years. So the.
Shape that's trying to get on that call.
You know, we had to replace the column. So there was no way to find it unless you happened to drill your exploratory hole at that exact spot.
So what we can, I mean, the best you can do is in the initial site visits, look at obviously as much as we can, and then try to guess how much, what the extent of it is. So you might look at a little bit, you can't see everything, but you're like, man, I've seen 5 spots, 4 of them look out of shape. So there's probably a lot of bumps to the building, and then at least it's early on in the project. And you know that once all the finishes and stuff are removed, they're gonna need to do more for us to make.
But yeah, whenever you're dealing with an existing building, I guess encourage your developers to have a little bit larger contingency than they normally would. Right?
We wanted them to do full interior demolition before we started construction, but they wanted to fund it all together, so they didn't pay for all that.
Yeah.
Fully furnished, fully built
I
out.
mean, you try to steer them in the right direction, it sounds like. Exactly. Well, you know, we've already talked about these projects, but I'll just get into a little bit more in depth about them. So this is the 1313 L Street project. We have the existing building on the left, which was a little bit unusual because it's a steel frame building in Washington, DC. They do exist. And it was 5 stories above grade. And then we came back with a 10-story apartment building in its place on top of the existing.
You reuse the garage or
Yes.
parts of the building.
Yeah, so this is a P1 level. It's all existing steel frame. We made some modifications. But that all basically remained at that upper parking level. Similarly, at the first floor, a lot of modifications were made, but this was an existing steel frame that essentially remained. And then, as Ben mentioned, the second floor became a transfer floor. So this is all new steel framing, big steel beams. And then above that was with the C-shaped layout, as he also mentioned. And then above that was load-bearing light gauge walls with a thin, I think a 5 or 6 inch thick slab, epicor deck, and a concrete slab, long span system spanning between those walls.
The epicor is again set up.
It's a metal deck. It's a long span metal deck. So it's a shored system. It can span maybe like 10 feet or something unshored. But typically with these layouts, these unit layouts, we're just using the demising walls as load bearing, and they shore the deck mid span while the concrete, this board is yours. And then they move it up another little and there's. So that. This is another job that had been mentioned, 1125 15th Street. This one's just starting construction now. And this one was very different. Basically keeping the entire building and just taking pieces out, adding pieces. Their existing rooftop did not look anything like this. There was a mechanical penthouse up there and just a roof. So they added a pool, interior space, amenity on the roof, and some exterior amenity space as well. This, again, this light well along the property line on the right side here was added to get light into those units theoretically. There is an adjacent building that's not seen here in this, that's right up against that our existing building. And then what's a little bit unique is that we added balconies to the exterior, which is not an easy thing to do. The existing facade in place. It's just a plan view, the demo plan here on the right and the new work plan on the left that shows the new balconies. And then again, this is where we demoed the existing slab to create that light well. And then just showing you some of the structural work. The level 7 plan on the right here, this is pretty typical. But basically, we cut out that big notch in the concrete slab, two-way concrete slab. So we had to put a steel column in there to help prop up all those slabs. And then that comes all the way down to the second floor where we've got this W44 by 290 steel beam that picks that up and takes it back to the existing columns. But it's over the drive aisle down to the garage, so there's a lot of headroom there. So it worked out. Yeah, so just to summarize, there are opportunities out there for reusing those existing office buildings that aren't being utilized for their originally intended purpose. And we think there's some business opportunities for architects and engineers to work on those projects. They're nothing new. They've been done for many years, but it's certainly a hot topic these days just because of the amount of office spaces that is available and not being used. And like we said before, it's a sustainable way to proceed in downtown areas where you have existing buildings. We do have some knowledge about documenting that what they call it, the bodied carbon, and we can help with that if you guys be interested. Yeah. I think we've touched on all this before, but I appreciate you guys' attention. And I'll let you guys get back to work. Any
questions or any more, Roland?
No,
Thanks for joining.
We did a new building, infill mid block for 40 to 50.
But yeah, we're doing a few studies now where they're doing interior bedrooms and
Even existing designs on the street look, we're finding is saying, insistence on upgrading energy codes and whatnot, and then that kills that